Okay, hello, my name is Christina Tabakhorst. I'm a field ag engineer with Iowa State Extension down in southeast Iowa. And today I have with me Russ Yukin. He's a beef and swine specialist with ISU Extension and Outreach, located more in north central Iowa. And really with the recent widespread damage that we've had across the state to cornfields, we wanted to do an interview on a few options for producers that might allow them to maybe salvage some value from their damaged fields, possibly using livestock, whether it be their own livestock or maybe working with neighbors or local producers in their area. And specifically in this interview, we'll be talking about options for using the forage in a damaged field by grazing cattle or baling that dry forage. So I guess to start, Russ, how well can cattle clean up field residue in some of these damaged fields? Like, is this a good option for managing that residue?
Well, they certainly can do a pretty good job of cleaning fields. Producers that have had cow-calf operations and have grazed corn stalks after harvest know that they'll clean up the grain fairly well, and even a lot of the corn stalks or forage that's out there. So even though this isn't harvested corn, the cattle should do a fairly good job of going after the ears of corn that are there. The difference would be, we've got a lot more forage available at this point anyway. The grain is mature, so we need to make some adjustments on that. The key thing is being able to limit the amount of grain that they have, and the best way to do that is strip grazing, which we'll talk about some more.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, so it might be a good option to kind of help with some of that potentially volunteer corn in the next growing season, kind of clean that up. So before a producer grazes or bales or whatever on this damaged field, are there any questions they should ask their insurance provider?
Well, certainly if they have crop insurance, they need to talk to their agent and more than likely get the field appraised. And my understanding is if it's appraised, and they typically call it a total loss, and that field's released, producers can do whatever they want to with it. But of course, that's up to the appraiser and the producer. So that's the first step. And then basically, if it's not a total loss, they need to find out what they can do from the standpoint of grazing or any kind of harvest and leaving check strips. But again, they just need to visit with their insurance agent on that.
Okay. So if they're going to graze this field, what are the big infrastructure needs that they're going to need?
Well, as we mentioned before, we think probably strip grazing, being able to fence off an area that to allow the cattle access to that area is key. And of course, they're going to have access to water. So if producers have been using fields for grazing corn stalks, probably they have some perimeter fence, and they would need to figure out, how to lay out some strips in that field, probably using some sort of electric fencing. And then how are the cattle going to get access to water in that system? If they need to walk back to water, that's not too bad. If they need to pump water, at least for a short period of time till things freeze up, you can pump water through, hoses on the surface, that kind of thing. But as soon as we start getting into colder weather, try and fence it off. We'd say try to figure out, what length of strips that they want. You can probably go out with a bush hog or maybe some sort of tillage equipment and make some paths through the field so it's easier to put the fence in. Fence that length of the strip off, and then again, we'll talk about sizing those strips, but make some other paths that you can put a a fence crossways in between your two side fences and allow access to a paddock. And basically you need two fences, one that you would open up on a daily basis and one on the back side of that strip, and then move the fence that you just opened up to the other side of that strip, so that, and then you don't need any back fence on the area that's already grazed. They can have free access to that. So not a great way of explaining it, but you know, where the field's all down, you know, they have a lot of flexibility on how they would lay that out.
Okay, so you mentioned we need to try and limit the amount of grain, or control a little bit better the amount of grain that the cattle are getting out in these fields. So what are the cautions with all that grain left out in the field for grazing? And then how can a producer estimate how much grain is there?
Yeah, those are good questions. And, you know, I don't know that we've got any research to really back up all these, but we can make some assumptions that based off, you know, some of the work that's been done on grazing harvested corn that's had a lot of corn loss and that kind of thing. But, you know, first of all, we could just kind of assess how much dry matter is out there. Cattle consume dry matter, not moisture. And so if you think of a normal silage harvest, a lot of this corn, you know, would have 20+ ton yield. And at 35% dry matter, it's about 16,000 pounds, 8 ton of dry matter. And then, you know, from a grain yield, you can look at that and say that about 45% of that is grain, 55% of that might be forage. So we can start looking at it that way. You can also look at, you know, number of ears of corn that they might have access to. Average ear of corn, it has about 0.8 of a pound of grain on it. The other thing where this is not mature grain in a lot of cases, it's probably going to have a lower test weight. So we'd want to make those adjustments too. But as far as the amount that we would allow, most people wouldn't feed this much if they were actually feeding a cow-calf operation, but you could probably get up to 10 pounds of corn in a cow that's weaned a calf and do that fairly safely and prevent any kind of nutritional problems from acidosis or founder and those kind of problems that you can get into if they eat too much corn. And that's really what we're trying to do. If we would allow access to a big area, they're just going to continue to eat corn and probably overindulge in that, overeat corn and run into these other problems. So as a starter, we'd probably try to limit it to the 10 pounds of corn. If they're nursing a calf, or if they're fall calving cows that are kind of in peak lactation, we could work them up to some higher levels of corn. But it's just kind of a process of figuring out how much corn is in an area. You know, you can look at what a normal yield would be, adjust it for lower test weight, make some assumption on how much they're going to consume of that. We would say on the grain part, they're going to probably get about, 90% of those ears. So if they're used to going out in corn stalks and cleaning up corn after harvest, they're pretty aggressive at finding those ears of corn. And especially if you limit access, they're going to forage around in that area quite a bit and find most of that corn that's down. So the other side of that, if you start doing all these calculations and assumptions there, and to limit that, it's a pretty small area that one cow needs per day, making some assumptions on yield and how much they're going to get. One cow might get about 10 pounds of corn off 60 square feet of area. So you're not going to graze a lot of area with a small herd of cows. The other thing, if people have feeder cattle, you know, they're probably not as going to be accustomed to grazing. They're not going to be as aggressive at going after the ears of corn. So that's going to be a little bit different situation, and probably limiting them to 1% of their body weight on grain intake is what we would need to do for them.
Okay. So if we're talking about cows and calves that aren't maybe getting fed a lot of grain right now, do you suggest working them up to the 10 pounds per day?
Yeah,
Or you,
that's a good point, Christina. Before turning them out in something like this, where they're going to have access to quite a bit of grain, we should be feeding them grain beforehand for at least a week to 10 days, starting them out with 2 to 3 pounds and working them up to that 10 pounds over that period. And then even before turnout, make sure that they're full, so they're not hungry and really, again, just overeat when they're turned out.
okay. Would there be any other grain quality concerns? You mentioned test weight. A lot of this might be low test weight or quality grain. Some of it's flat and pretty close to the ground. Some of it's drought stressed. Are you concerned at all or very much about any other, molds, toxins, or nitrates or things like that?
Well, that's always a concern. Obviously, in this situation, we're not. There's not a good way to really sample a lot of it and test it. The longer it's there, and it's particularly with more moisture or something like that, and ground or soil contact, there's chances for mold development, no doubt about that. But it's going to be hard for them to sort it out. So we're going to let the cattle sort that out for us. And cattle are typically can stand a little bit higher levels of the toxins. Just because we have mold doesn't mean there's any mycotoxin there, but we just don't know. So it's something to be watching for. If it looks like it's a lot of corn is moldy, trying to determine what kind of mold, and obviously we could shell some of that and figure out if there's a toxin there by testing it. But it's another concern, but again, it's not really very manageable in this situation. So.
Okay. And kind of to switch a little bit and talk about possibly baling some of this corn as a dry forage. Is that a possibility that you can see, and any best practices you would recommend for folks?
Well, we certainly understand why producers would want to do that. If they didn't have a way to get silage harvested and store silage, or a way to feed silage, putting up some dryer forage in a bale, a lot more people have access to that kind of equipment, and it could be easier to store. Again, the big concerns here will be trying to get that dried uniformly so it stores well in the bale, and then how to get it harvested, primarily how to get it into a windrow that could be baled without a lot of soil contamination and wrecking equipment, to be frank, I guess. So probably what they need to think about doing is running some sort of machinery, like even a batwing mower, bush hog, that's going to chop that corn up some. That's going to do a couple things. It'll allow them to maybe rake that a little bit better if they're going to put it in a windrow. And if they run that over and let it dry down for a couple days, you're going to get more uniform drying, probably a lot of moisture yet, and some of the in the stalks, and particularly in the ears, that where they're kind of covered up and um, not getting access to sun. They're probably not drying out as uniformly as the rest of the plant is. It may look dry, but there's probably, and where that moisture is, that's going to create a hot spot in the bale if that starts to spoil. So again, cutting that up, ears, so that they have a better chance to dry out. So obviously it's not a perfect situation, not going to get that uniform drying that you'd probably like. And then the soil contamination, if you can manage the raking or baling process so that you're not picking up a lot of that's close to the ground to minimize the soil getting in the bale, that's going to help too from a quality standpoint. I know I've seen situations, this was back about 12 years ago, where we had a similar situation, and people were harvesting the corn stalks, and it was basically for bedding. And when they were baling, it was just a cloud of dust out there, a lot of soil contamination in that. So drying it out, getting it into a windrow without soil contamination, finally baling it, those are all issues, and producers are probably going to use the equipment that they have available to do that. And that's going to be a wide range of types of things. And so they kind of got to figure out what works, I guess, for them.
Yeah, definitely a learning curve there. So I guess that's kind of the last of my questions. The only other thing I would share today would be an additional resource if you want to learn a little bit more information on some of the things you talked about today. One good place is to look at the Iowa Beef Center website, iowabeefcenter.org. And there's also a fact sheet or a publication on there called Grazing Down Corn Fact Sheet. And that was written by you, Russ, and a couple other beef specialists, I believe. So a good place.
Yeah, that gets into a little bit more detail on, trying to figure out, how much grain's there and some of the assumptions that you could make. We don't have anything better than estimates, assumptions on, how much of the forage, how much of the grain they're going to actually eat. So having a lot of flexibility and monitoring the cattle to, kind of see how much of that grain they're actually picking up, and those are going to be key things. Mentioning the forage, when we're allowing in that strip grazing on a fairly small area, there's not enough dry matter in that area to actually satisfy those cattle. So there's probably a need to think about allowing them excess or supplemental dry matter. Some of that could be from previously grazed areas. Maybe an adjoining pasture or hayfield could be used as well. I'll let them have access to that for picking up that additional forage that they are not getting from that strip. So again, that's kind of all explained in that fact sheet.
Okay. Well, great. I think this was really helpful. Hopefully folks find it helpful. So thanks a lot, Russ, for joining us today and for the interview and sharing some of this information.
Yep, I appreciate it. Thank you.